I could happily stay out there and listen to Michelle and Lisa for a while, but you are stuck with me and a session on charter schools. This year is the 25th anniversary of the first charter law in America, Minnesota in 1991. And indeed, I believe Anthony's first slide will show where the charter schools are today, charter school laws are today. We'll get to where the schools are in a minute. I'm going to be joined up here in a couple of seconds after they finish rearranging the deck chairs on this Titanic by three of the most knowledgeable people in the charter space. And we are going to talk about what we've learned in 25 years, a education reform that, according to everybody's calculation, has drawn more philanthropic support than any other education reform of the last 25 years. So this has been a huge investment of American philanthropy overall. It's worth talking about what we've accomplished, what we've learned from it, and of course what the future holds. I think everybody knows that charter schools are independently operated public schools, tax supported, open to all comers, generally lottery-based for admission, but independently operated, not by the district, not by the bureaucracy. In Ted Coldery's phrase, the exclusive franchise of the district to operate public schools has been broken in places where there are charter schools today. I'm also here to flog a new book by Bruno Mano and Brandon Wright and myself, Charter Schools at the Crossroads, coming out next month from Harvard Education Press. On your table are some articles based on it and a flyer if you would like to get hold of it. We try very hard in this book to take stock of what chartering has accomplished, what its dilemmas and challenges are, and what its future might hold, including some ways in which the future might be different from the present, and certainly from the past. So have a look at that if you are interested. We're going to have audience participation via clicker in just a couple minutes, but first let's look at a couple of more background slides. This is the enrollment growth of charter schools over the past 25 years. We are up to 2.5 going on 3 million kids in these alternative public schools. This is an astonishing thing to do in 25 years given the glacier-like tendencies of American public education. And I think that this is something to be proud of. Let's go on to the next one, Anthony. Watch the map and the years and the schools, and look at where the schools now are as the years have gone by. This is both a pretty cool graphic, but also, I think, a very impressive demonstration of the spread of this reform idea across the country. Look at that. Okay, it'll repeat as many times as we leave it up there. Let's go on to the next slide, Anthony. This is market share in major cities of charter schools within the district. And these are just major cities, the 50,000 student kind. There are lots of other places, smaller places, Flint, Kansas City, Dayton, goes on, where the charter market share is over 30% now. It just doesn't show on this slide because they developed it with the major cities. Probably best known now are, in fact, New Orleans, where almost everybody goes to charter schools, DC, where, as Michelle just said, pretty nearly half the kids in public education are in charters today, and Detroit, where I think you could say charters have been a refuge from a pretty much collapsing public school system in recent years. This will be hard to read from the other side of the room, but let's have a look. This is just some basic facts. We're getting on to 7,000 schools. Last year, 400 new ones opened and 272 closed. This is a good thing, both that the openings exceeded the closings, but also that schools close. Think how many district schools closed last year. Most of the charter schools that closed deserved to close. They were not doing a good job with kids, or they didn't know how to run themselves, or they were going to broke. This is a dynamic market, not a static thing. 250,000 additional kids in this year in charter schools. Almost 7% of all public schools are now charters. Most of them are urban. The majority of the schools are independent. You hear a lot about the big CMOs, the KIPS and the Achievement Firsts and the others that operate dozens and dozens or hundreds of schools. And yet most of them are still what some people call mom and pop schools, the one-offs, the schools that are independently operated. And I think that's very important to keep in mind, particularly for philanthropists, many of whom have been devoting themselves to the large CMOs and the EMOs, the for-profit ones. 2/3 of the kids in the schools are racial minorities, more than is the case in district schools. And finally, the majority of kids in charter schools come from low-income families. That is the upfront backgrounder. Team, come on up here when you're ready, if you've got your mics on. And we are going to do a little bit of audience participation via the voting clickers on your table in front of you. They look like this. Look at the slide. You will, when we put up the questions, you will vote for one answer only, even though in several of these questions, it looks like all the answers have something to be said for them. And Anthony's magic technology will tabulate your results. You can change your mind during the voting period, but only your last vote counts. Only donors are supposed to vote. I can't monitor who's voting at which tables. And the first question is, for your own philanthropy work over the past 5 years, what fraction of it went into charter schools? If it was more than half, please click A. If it was 25 to 49% B, et cetera. For your own philanthropy, on average, over the last 5 years, how much of it went into charter schools? Voting is open. It will stay open for just a few seconds, and then we will see if the technology does what it's supposed to do. Going. Got a tabulation? There we go. Have a look. 31% of you have put more than half your philanthropy into charter schools. 19% of you, more than a quarter. More than a quarter of you, less than a quarter. And 22% have not given anything to charter schools. Next question. Of the options shown, and this is A through G, what, in your opinion, has been the greatest single accomplishment of charter schools that give you confidence about the next 25 years? Their success with underprivileged, underserved kids, their sustained academic growth, their market share in major cities, the variety of different kinds of schools and missions that have arisen, the innovation that they have pioneered, their ability to attract extraordinary human talent, or the evidence that they show of the demand for public school alternatives. You've got to pick one. I think they all have something going for them. Pick the one you think is the greatest accomplishment that bodes well for the next 25 years. Voting is open. Going. Go. Interesting. The largest number of you think that success with underserved kids, and the second largest number of you think innovation. And the third largest number of you think the evidence of demand for alternatives to district schools. And everything else got some points, but not as many. Next question. In the past 25 years, what's the single most important lesson that charter supporters should have learned? A through H this time. Facilities are a big challenge that we didn't anticipate well enough. We underestimated the accountability and quality control issues and authorizing issues. We shouldn't have accepted less money per kid in as many places as we did. The schools have insufficient true autonomy and are subject to regulatory creep. We overemphasized the no excuses kind of school at the expense of other models. We underestimated the relentless political opposition. We don't have good enough results. Results aren't sufficient for the future. We need a communication strategy to go with them. And finally, we should, as Michelle was saying, talk to communities before we land a school in them. You got to pick one. They all have something going for them. Which do you think is the most important lesson that we should have learned, whether we did or not? Voting is open, going, tabulation. Whoa! Well, there's three peaks on this mountain range. Underestimated the accountability issues. Just about tied with that. Where are we? F, we underestimated the opposition. And finally, we didn't talk to communities enough before putting schools down in them. And lastly, this is actually a mathematical question, and if Sal Khan were still here, he'd know the answer, or would show you how to calculate it. If charters continue on their recent trajectory 25 years from now, what percentage of all kids in America will be attending them? What's your best guesstimate of the percentage that will be in charter schools in 25 years if we stay on track? The correct answer is, and you guessed it, 55% of all American school kids would be in charter schools in 25 years if the enrollment growth of recent years were to be sustained. I believe we have Neerav Kingsland to thank for the calculation. So thank you, Neerav. Thank you, Anthony. Thank you, technology. We'll do a few more of these at the end if there's time regarding additional predictions for the future. I am joined mercifully by Nina Rees, Neerav Kingsland, and Kevin Hall. They are well described in the materials in front of you. In the conference material, I have known Nina and Kevin for just about forever, and I hope to know Neerav for the forever that's coming. And they know as much about charter schools as anybody I know from their current, recent, past, and present experiences. So we're not going to spend time on introductions. We are instead going to leap right in. And guys were previewed a handful of questions, and so let's start with lessons learned. What, in your opinion, is the single most important lesson that charter supporters should have learned over the past 25 years? And I'm not going to ask all these questions of everybody, but this one I think you should each have an opinion about. What should we have learned, Nina?
I would say, as the survey brought up, the importance of quality and the important role that authorizers play in the equation. We have a model law at the National Alliance, and every year we rank states based on how well they rank against that model law. And I would say that the highest ranked law is, in my opinion, no more than a B- or a B, depending on who you ask. So we have a lot more work to do, and I think once the law is passed, how well it's implemented really hinges on who is in charge of attracting the right talent to the state, how well they're managing the school leaders, how much transparency there is in the contracts that they've signed. So if there was one thing that I would point to that is extremely important as a lesson, is the importance of making sure our authorizer are of high quality and that we're holding them accountable as much as we're holding the schools accountable.
So a market basket of quality control and accountability issues, insufficiently anticipated and needed to be learned for the future. Neerav, what's your view?
Sure. For me, there's one incredible lesson over the past 25 years when you look back, and it's that charter school market share and quality have only moved in one direction, and that direction's up. So we've gone from 0 to 3 million kids, and while we've done that, we've rapidly improved the quality of the sector. Urban charters specifically are probably one of the best studied and most highly significant effects we've seen in any education reform effort. And they've actually doubled their impact over the past 5 to 6 years. And then the national charter market quality, while it's not great yet, is on the right trajectory. It's moving up. So, the people in this room, myself included, have tried so many things to make education better. And this is one of the few things in the country that we can point to that has actually scaled 3 million kids. And as it's scaled, it's gotten better every year. It's just very, very rare that you find something that can do that at a systematic level. And with charter schools, we just might have that.
So we already have a bit of a contrast here. We have Nina saying we got to pay more attention to quality control, and we have Neerav being the bluebird of happiness. That's a good start. So Kevin, where do you come down?
Yeah, I would say I think that both Nina and Neerav are right, and I actually would argue that the improvements, and we've got a long way to go on the accountability, improvements on the accountability are also helping drive some of those improvements. But I actually think the two big things for me, looking back on the 25 years, and I was a younger man, I guess, when we all started. We all were, yes. I think one is showing really what's possible. I mean, I think if you'd polled a bunch of people in 1991, that the idea of someone like Brook Charter Schools in Massachusetts being the highest performing set of schools in the state, regardless of demography, and they serve 80% low-income students and 90% African American Latino students, being the top performing district, beating Weston, beating Wellesley, et cetera, and people would have said, no way, never happened. I think if you'd said in New Orleans, which is approaching the state average, in 2004 and polled a bunch of people and said, is this possible? People would have said, no way. So I think one big thing is this idea of what is possible has been a big win for the charters. I think the second piece is, I would argue, the very best of what's happening are a relentless improvement machine. The people that we have the privilege to back in our work, they just are maniacal about getting better. And I think they mirror really the best organizations in our country on that focus. And I don't think that's something that we've seen in K-12.
Thank you very much. One more everybody question having to do with the role of the people in the room. You're looking at a bunch of philanthropists. What has philanthropy done that's been really important for the charter movement, and what mistake has philanthropy made with respect to the charter movement looking backward? Let's go down the row again. Nina, what's been contributed, besides money, of course, and what has been done wrong?
Well, the first one is easier to answer.
Of course.
As someone who seeks funding.
Before you insult all the donors in the room with their errors.
I would say so when you look across the states that have had growing charter school movements, one of the factors that leads to the growth is philanthropy. So you can have a great law, you can have talent, but it still remains that charters only receive about 70 cents of every dollar that follows students to traditional schools, and facilities finance is usually not baked into the funding formula, or charters don't come with a building attached to them. So having a strong philanthropic base in those states that have taken off has been extremely important. In fact, some would argue that not having that can be extremely detrimental to the movement. So just the laws and policies are not enough. So definitely funding and making sure that increasingly also focusing on the growth of the high-performing networks, I feel has been extremely important in kind of highlighting the best of the best and scaling the ones that are kind of from good and trying to go to great. In terms of drawbacks, I actually talked to a few school operators about this, and one of the things that they would highlight is if the single-handed focus on just academic achievement sometimes could lead to high attrition rates and expulsion rates. So we just have to be cognizant of the fact that if your focus is just on raising student achievement, closing the gap, graduating students, and you don't hold attrition and suspension, into your equation, you are going to have some schools that have very high results but may have a large number of students who are dropping out for whatever reason. I'm just putting this out there as one of the facts that has come up. And the other thing, quite frankly, is to the extent you're only focused on scaling the high-performing networks, there are a lot of others who are kind of in the middle that could become better with some support and in management, they never stay focused on the mediocre to make them better, but in education, I do think to the extent you're trying to attract a more diverse population of operators to the mix, paying a little bit of attention to the ones that have the potential to become great if they had additional resources, and being a little bit more strategic about who they are, where they are, and how to support them
so
would
maybe
help. Yeah.
metrics that are a little too narrow and too much emphasis on already proven superstars.
Right.
Okay, and Neerav, contributions and errors.
In terms of contributions, what's been amazing to me is if you look at every great CMO in this country, from the success to the KIP to some of the ones you maybe know less about but are thriving under Kevin's portfolio, they really were born out of two things. One was an entrepreneur who saw the world, saw injustice, and was willing to sacrifice their life to change the world. And second, whether it was year -1, year 0, year 1, at some point a philanthropist joined them. They either coached them as a CEO, they took a board seat, they bailed them out when they made a mistake on their budget and didn't have time to go to a big national funder, and they wrote a $50,000 check. This partnership between entrepreneur and philanthropist and the co-evolution of those two entities is really remarkable, and it's really the creation story of a lot of CMOs. And this can happen whether you can give $50,000 a year or whether you can give $150 million a year. That personal investment of joining with an entrepreneur and helping them grow something, I think has been a remarkable story in the philanthropic community.
So not just writing a check, engagement also.
Definitely.
On the negative side?
What really worries me is less backwards looking and more forward looking. I now work for two philanthropists and talk to many others across the country. And something I hear is that the charter sector is a crowded sector. And so maybe we don't need our money here, and we need to do things that are getting less attention. And while I get the emotional resonance of that, for me, the mind-blowing kind of analogy would be like a VC firm saying, tech's crowded. I don't think we need to invest in this anymore. Let's go back to the Stone Age or whatever.
You're in Silicon Valley. You do know that. Okay.
The reason it's crowded is because it's working. And we've gone from 0 to 3 million kids, and we need to go from 3 million to 10 million, and we need to double and triple our effectiveness while we go from 3 million to 10 million. And that's going to take scale capital. And so we don't need people walking away. We need people doubling down with their energy, with their money, and we need to take the movement to another level. And I worry that scale is something that feels less special if you're a philanthropist, because it's not your idea anymore, and you're one piece of a bigger thing. But maybe there's a power in that, and we need to avoid, I think, that this thing is done and really double down on changing this country, and I think we have an opportunity to do that. But I do think there is some risk that we take our eye off the ball.
Thank you very much. Kevin, accomplishments and...
yes. Absolutely. So accomplishments at the Charter School Growth Fund, the term that we have for what Neerav is describing, this partnership between a philanthropist and an entrepreneur, is we always try to figure out with a brand new entrepreneur who is the godmother or godfather. And that's our term for what Neerav's describing. And I actually think that's incredibly special and has been something that I think marks what a lot of the success that we have seen in this work. And I think part of our hope is that there are more godmothers and godfathers out there who want to pair with this set of really amazing entrepreneurs who are coming online.
Given all the recent agitation about gender, you should probably just say God person, shouldn't you?
God persons, okay. Thank you. Yes, fair enough. I think the thing I probably worry about the most is this is a long game. We're in a 50 or 60 year movement, and it's hard to as a philanthropist or any investor to try to think, hey, I'm making this bet may not pay off fully until it's my kids who are the beneficiaries of this. I think that's really, really, really hard. And I think that's what I worry about. Are we going to have staying power? And as Neerav said, for new people to come in and sort of join into that battle.
Okay, some one-off questions for individual panelists, commencing with Neerav. Going forward, should we focus primarily philanthropy and energy in the movement on a handful of cities that are high need and charter friendly and disadvantaged, or should we try to get charter schools scattered like Johnny Appleseed in as many places as possible?
So I'll duck the question a little bit.
No, I'm not going to let you try.
But I'll try to give a useful framework to help philanthropists maybe understand where they're at in this. So, the way I see communities develop is probably in about 4 different shifts. There's the 0 to 15% charter market share in a community, 15 to 30, 30 to 60, and then 60 plus. And what I feel incredibly strongly about is we need more 30 to 60s and probably 40 to 60s across this country. I don't think we're going to see the best of charters until we have these ecosystems that are vibrant and have majority market share in cities. And potentially, I don't think we're going to see the best of districts until they have that pressure on them and they're seeing what's possible, to Kevin's point, right in their hometown. A deep part of me believes that 60 to 100 is actually a very useful thing, and that's what we did in New Orleans. But I don't think we know that yet, and I feel much more confident that 40 to 60 is the right thing. So if I were a philanthropist, I would try to think deeply about my own community and understand what phase I'm in. Am I in the 0 to 15 proof point? Am I in the 15 to 30 nudging at the system? Am I at the 40 to 60, we kind of are part of the system, or am I going to try to make the whole system? And I think there's a different set of strategies you need to use along that continuum. And I do think 15 to 30 is probably the hardest. When you're under 15, you're this niche player that nobody really cares about. When you get to 20 to 25 to 30, the whole thing turns on you, and you'll have some of the most vicious political battles your city has ever seen. And so I think it's really important to understand where you're on that spectrum, and again, not to duck the question totally, but I think we need to move along that bell curve in every community in this country.
But just to push you a little bit, your 40 to 60 emphasis seems to presuppose a kind of tipping point theory where the district will actually change in response to that much competition. Am I interpreting you correctly?
I think it's a possibility that we don't know. So if you take that slide that was shown earlier of 3 cities that have kind of gotten into that world, it's Detroit, DC, and New Orleans. So we have, an N of 3, so I don't think we should make strong conclusions about what we know. In New Orleans, the district went away. In Detroit, we have stagnation, and it's not a pretty picture, and the district surely hasn't responded. And in DC, we perhaps have the highest performing school district in the country. So I think we have interesting minor data points, and time will tell. To the extent we get more Detroits in New Orleans, then I think we need to go to 100. To the extent we have more DCs, I think we can say, okay, this whole thing's working.
So you've actually got multiple theories of action going on here, and it sort of depends on the circumstance. I mean, Rees was pretty clear that the growth of charters really helped, besides giving a bunch of kids better schools, gave her some cover for doing things with the district that she wouldn't have otherwise been able to do. But as you just said, Detroit with the same percentage, or a greater percentage, is sort of brain dead and kind of unresponsive in this situation. So but there it's a refuge. It's an alternative for kids that need it.
So I think time will tell. We're at the early phase of the city density movement, and I'm very curious and eager to see what the next 10 cities hold around the 50% market share number.
But you were not saying, let me be clear, just Johnny Appleseed, let's have one charter here and one charter there, sort of like throwing out M&Ms.
Save for a 50% market share city starts with a 5% market share city.
Okay.
And so, sorry, I ducked it again.
Okay.
It's all I'm
Got to have an M&M before you can have a full-fledged candy bar.
Okay, there you go.
Nina, what about the enemies within, the not the external foes of charter schools, but the greedy operators, the bad schools, the flawed virtual schools, the rotten apples in the barrel? What do we do about those going forward?
Well, we need to close them. We need to find better ways to make the case for why they should be closed, make the case to parents, make sure that we ourselves as a community, our association partners are calling for their closures. There's one association right now, the one in California, that has taken the lead on actually calling out the worst performing charters in the state every year. That list is not very big, but just narrowing the focus on, okay, these are not charter schools. As a community, we need to come together and do a better job of defining who is not really part of the family, and also legislatively figure out a way to close them. Now, the answer is easy, but getting it done, of course, is challenging. We work very closely with our state association partners. We try to get other associations to also follow the California model, and I will say, and at least one of the associations in the room, it was very difficult to have this conversation because the discussion then becomes about a whole host of other things that unfortunately have nothing to do with the quality of the school, but that we should take into account in the process. So it's politically challenging, but I think for our movement to thrive and actually, gain the moral ground, we have to be much more forceful about having that discussion. One other thing, again, our organization has put out a paper around the online charter schools in our space and what a bad job they're doing at raising student achievement. Not all of them are doing a bad job, but the accountability structure that our brick and mortar schools are currently coming under is, for whatever reason, not capturing the benefits that online charters are putting forth. And in many cases, because those charters are going after a certain type of student population that may not be the ideal student population to be in an online charter school, they're also, producing very poor results. So I do think right now we're also at a place where we can say that in some states, if you took the performance of the online charters off the table, the performance of the whole sector could be dramatically improved.
So one of the points Bruno and Brandon and I make in the book is that we think authorizers need more tools in their own toolkit than just closing bad schools. You've repeated what has been 25-year charter doctrine, which is if the school isn't any good, don't let it continue. Speaking as an authorizer in Ohio, which the Fordham Foundation has been, we've frequently found ourselves, a couple times found ourselves in these situations where, yeah, the charter school is mediocre, charter doctrine would say close it, but in reality the alternatives for those kids are even worse than the mediocre charter school that they're going to. Do you close that school? What else can you do? And one of my personal conclusions is that if the authorizer is the actionable agent here, they need to have more things they could do than just renew it or close it. Some way of replacing it or transferring operation of it. I know that New Orleans has run into these things, and I know that these things have been worked out in other places. We haven't worked them out yet well in Dayton, Ohio. Kevin. How do you balance, going forward, the need for investment in just schools, more kids' butts in more good schools, versus investment in what you might call charter infrastructure, the authorizer stuff, the facilities stuff, the policy stuff, the human capital stuff, all the things that sort of are correlates of schools that are going to be worth attending?
Sure. Well, I think all the sort of list of the things that you put into the charter ecosystem or enabling pieces obviously have a direct effect on the ability to have more, as your term, butts in seats. So I think I don't think you can do one without the other. I think a strategy that has both is going to be the smart long-term investment strategy. I actually think in many ways they're complementary in the sense that as groups gain scale or high performers gain scale and share in a market, they're able to create more political power. And that political power is necessary because, to Neerav's point, particularly on that curve, and I might even put it closer to 10%, where it starts to matter. And that's when you see the most vicious fights. Nashville, Los Angeles, et cetera, those guys all hit basically the 10 to 12% mark, and that's when the fight really, really began. So I think you got to do both.
Can you quantify it for philanthropy?
Yeah, sure.
75% schools, 25% infrastructure, what would you do?
Yeah, I think again, it depends on if you're investing nationally or locally and where you are on the sort of local community market perspective. I would say we probably as a sector, we've under invested in the work that Nina and others have done on advocacy. So if I were to put more bets going forward, I definitely do that. I think there's a bunch of different ways you can do that. I think on the authorizing front, I think getting the policies right, as Nina's talked about, is critical. I think that, the hard part is a lot of the authorizing is done by school districts, right? And school districts don't necessarily have the incentive to close the bad performers. In fact, for many of them, they're going to give a harder time to the top performers than they are to go after the bad performers. So you got to figure out how to go after that.
Cut you off just because we've got to keep moving. Neerav, back to you. Another sort of trade-off or balancing act question. Investment in strong CMOs with track records, or in startups and one-offs and little operators that have a shot at becoming good schools?
So I do think, and this is in part a testament to Kevin's great work, that when you think of the pipeline of negative nothing to 0 to 1 school to 3 school to 5 school to 50 schools, we're actually probably strongest at 5 school to 50 schools. We're well capitalized there. We have great teams like Kevin's team nurturing those entrepreneurs. And that works incredibly hard, so I don't want to downplay how much smarter we need to get there. But the people working in that space are just unbelievable. Kevin's team plus the entrepreneurs he's working with are some of the best folks in the country. And I do worry that on some level there's a mix of lack of programmatic support, and for lack of a better phrase, lack of sexiness in starting a new charter school. So I do think 15 to 20 years ago, if you wanted to change the world, starting a charter school is one of the top 3 to 4 things a 28-year-old could do. And I don't know that that's still true anymore. And I don't know if because it feels crowded to the entrepreneur. I don't know if you're 28 and you look at the politics and you're like, charters are getting yelled at by the people who are my friends. So I worry about this, and it's starting to show up in the data. And the data is really murky here. But the best I can, and I do worry that we're not going to be able to keep up the 9 to 10% growth we're seeing if that unit growth in schools continues to drop. And so some of that does need to be from continued CMO growth, but the way, Kevin will tell you how hard it is from one CMO to go from one state to another. I'm highly skeptical this is going to be a sector that's going to be dominated by 3 players in 50 years. And it's much more likely to have a mix of 1s, 5s, 10s, and 20s scattered across the country. So I think we need to be much more disciplined about nurturing early stage entrepreneurs, creating more regional and national incubators, and just creating more space for the next new great schools to come online.
Okay, one more trade-off question, Kevin. No excuses schools versus other kinds of charter schools. I know this is something the Growth Fund has been struggling with. Sure. How to think about that balance going forward?
Yeah, I think we probably in our first fund invested in a variety of models. Would say probably the better part of our second fund, which we do 5-year work, we did probably more no excuses. And I would say in our current fund going forward, we're going to have a pretty wide diversity of models. Probably 12 to 15 very, very distinctive school models that we're backing. And I think, it feels like a little bit of the debate around no excuses, I kind of feel is, and thinking about some of the operators who you would think about on this, I think their models have moved a lot over the last 5 years.
You mean no excuses now? Have some excuses?
No, well, I actually think part of it is the term no excuses. I think, we all focus on the student, but I would argue a big part of the no excuses model is no excuses for the adults, right? That's the key part of it. It's not the no excuses for kids and discipline, et cetera. That's a piece of it, but the bigger part is it's no excuses for adults for performance.
Thank you. Last question from me before we open it up. So if you've got a question coming, we'll have a few minutes for a few of those. But Nina, what about the enemies without? What is the charter movement to do about the seemingly relentless and occasionally unexpected attacks from friends, former friends, sometimes civil rights groups, Democratic political candidates who used to be for them? What do we do?
Well, first you have to be very clear as to who are your enemies and who are people who are just challenge you to become better. And I think the enemy is trying to destruct and kind of get rid of charter schools altogether, and not getting confused that some of the criticisms they're throwing at us is designed to weaken us as a whole. We did an analysis last year looking at the social media conversation around charter schools, and we discovered that for every positive news story there were at least 3 to 4 negative impressions, which is the term they use for social media, in terms of things that people like Randy Weingarten at the American Federation of Teachers and Diane Ravitch put out. So it was alarming, but we didn't know what to do about this. Most of the people who gave us this data also really encouraged us to be more aggressive at selling the positive stories. The challenge with selling the positive stories in a vacuum is the media or the reporters that we're trying to influence, they usually don't try to cover positive pieces. They're looking for controversy. But we do need to pay attention to this, because to the extent you ignore the negative news, the people who are observing what's going on, who don't know what a charter school is, are going to shape or form their impressions of what a charter school is based on that negative news. So I think we just need to be more vigilant. So our work is primarily at the federal level. I should also just add that the federal government has been one of the best friends of the charter school movement since Bill Clinton took office. There's a program called the Charter Schools Program, which has now funded $3 billion in seed funding for the growth of new charter schools, and as of a few years ago also started to...
Did you say $3 billion?
$3 billion
With a B.
Since the mid-1990s. These are state grants for states to give startup dollars to charter schools with no strings attached. So when you talk about how you see the growth of the one-offs who don't have other philanthropic support, the feds have been one of the best sources of funding for this. Next to that, recently they've also doubled down on increasing the amount of funding for those networks that are doing a good job at raising student achievement. These could change in the next administration. We could potentially have a president who neither one of them have said a lot about charter schools or understand what charter schools are in the fundamental way that, say, President Obama was talking about charter schools on the campaign trail. And in the House and the Senate, you also have fewer people who understand and who are real staunch supporters. And so to the extent you're trying to continue to seed the growth of charter schools, and you think of the federal government as a way to supplement what philanthropy has done, we have to be vigilant, and they get their news from social media increasingly. So we're hopeful that we can do a better job of both selling the positive and also better defining who the enemies are and who should be fighting the enemies. And we feel very strongly that the ones fighting should be the parents and the school leaders and the community leaders, and we actually have quite a few of them. It's just that they're not always organized and ready to act.
So help Nina and her team. They are as close as we've got to a cockpit or a command post for nationally in these wars. We're going to open it up now. It would be best if you asked your question of one person. We're not going to go down the row, and would like you to identify yourself at the beginning. Yes, ma'am.
Hi, I'm Mally Locke, City Bridge Foundation, D.C.
Which foundation?
City Bridge.
City Bridge. City Bridge.
City Bridge.
Thank you.
We'll address this to Kevin.
Okay.
When you see the response of the NAACP and Black Lives Matter in their most recent public statements about charter schools, what has your response been, and what have your internal conversations at the fund been?
Sure. So I think a couple things. So one, we obviously disappointed in the idea of a moratorium, particularly for a lot of the folks that we back are literally running the best schools that are serving African American students in many cities around the country. So obviously, disappointment on that. I think many of the operators that we back, I think, are trying to figure out how to harness the voices of their parents and their students, and to do the sort of the digging work, the hard work, to try to engage and bring more leaders in different communities to their schools. We are backing a set of very early stage entrepreneurs, so people who are running 0 to 2 schools, including Steve Perry, who Michelle talked about, amazing entrepreneur. So we have a special fund that is focused on, we'll back about 20 or 25 very, very early stage entrepreneurs of color who are launching or running very, very high performing schools that we think are going to be, have the chance to be the uncommons and successes and ideas of the world in the next 10 years.
Okay. Thank you. Next.
Oh, sorry. Yes, you're pointing at me, Checker?
Fine, I can't
Andy,
see you in the light.
Good. Andy Calkins with Next Generation Learning Challenges. I hope you're all going to come to Massachusetts this fall to help us pass our charter cap law. We can talk about that later. Yeah. You've done a great job of covering the basis on 2 of the ways people understand that charters can have a big impact. One of them is the sheer numbers one, and one of them is the competitive one. Will the districts respond? But there's a third one that feels as though it's got short shrift today in this discussion, and that dials back to the original idea of charters as laboratories that then other people, including district folks, can learn from. So we saw that at Summit yesterday. That's the whole idea with Base Camp. We see it with a place like New Tech, which started as a charter, but most of their 80 schools are regular traditional schools. We see it at City Bridge, where they're working with a cohort of mixture of districts and charters in DC. So I wonder to what degree you're all thinking about that as a potential reawakened dimension of charter impact, and to what degree you think it's actually real.
Not all. Pick a victim. Who do you want to answer that?
Whoever's burning most to answer that question.
That's Neerav.
So I hope the future is better than the past on this one, in that right now I remain fairly highly skeptical that districts have the right mindset, structures, and cultures to adopt the best of what charters are doing. In that sense, I think I'm really an institutionalist. I think great schools are delivered by great institutions, and teachers not the lever, school leaders not the lever, the institution is the lever, and that's part of what drew me to charter schools. And so you can't piecemeal a best practice into a dysfunctional system. Will that change over time? Maybe. And so maybe it's a combination of competitive pressure, restructuring districts, creating more autonomies, more culture, better leaders, that then allows for the space to best practices to come in. If I had to say the one that feels like in my mind has gotten somewhere is Teach Like a Champion. I mean, that came straight out of the Uncommon playbook. I mean, that book every year is one of the top education bestsellers. Most, even colleges of ed now, you'll find like heretically a copy lying around. So that's been an interesting one for me. Like, that's gone viral and packaged very deliberately by Doug and his team, and it's been exceptional. You know, the second one that I think could happen is tech. I don't say this with any high confidence at all, but there's a world where in 30 to 40 years, every school, private, public, charter, traditional public, traditional charter, is run on one of 10 to 15 platforms. And that those platforms are now being created. And I would say the two industry leaders in those platforms are Alt School, which is private, and Summit, which is charter. We'll see where Con heads. And to the extent that the charter community builds the platforms that schools then run on 20 years from now, that could be game-changing. But A, I don't know if the tech's good enough, and B, I don't know that even if you do tech to labor substitution in a district, if you'll see the gains we want to see. But I'm open to the idea that that could occur, and it would be great if it can.
Kevin, you're burning too.
Yeah, I would just say, I mean, I think a big thing that we're working on in the next 5 years is to work with all of the groups in our portfolio to essentially go open source. So everything that they're doing,
essentially go
open source.
Open source.
Everything that they're building for themselves, they're going to put on the web and give it away. And I think the question is whether or not we actually don't think districts are going to be the consumers of that. We think it's going to be teachers and principals, and so that you'll have adoption being driven much more by individual classrooms and potentially individual schools than by wholesale districts.
As happened with Teach Like a Champion.
Correct.
I mean, the uptake for that originally came from individual teachers wanting to be better teachers.
Correct.
Interesting. Okay, another question. Yes, ma'am.
This is a question probably from
You haven't identified yourself yet.
excuse me, Marina Wong with the Cynthia and George Mitchell Foundation.
Thank you.
Since governance is such a critical factor in school success, I'm curious, in a market where it's pretty saturated, is there an issue in finding enough quality people for the boards of these schools? And if it's an issue, how is it addressed? And I ask this because I founded a school in the Woodlands which had about 40,000 people. And it was a challenge to find quality board members, and they are highly resistant to any sort of training.
And they were highly resistant to training. Who do you want to answer that question, Marina? Neerav's burning again. Okay.
So it's a huge issue, and I think when I started, I leaned too much on the side of the entrepreneur rather than the side of the board in terms of understanding what's going to make something last for 30 years. So in New Orleans, we're at 95% charter, so the boards are the governance institution, at least at the most localized level. I think what's been amazing about that is people talk about a lack of democratization or a lack of civic ownership in the charter world, and we've seen nothing but the opposite in New Orleans. The fact that there's 200 to 300 board members who now spend once a month thinking deeply about the budgets, leadership, and practices of public schools in their city, that was not what happened in New Orleans in the 80s and 90s, where everybody was just checked out. So I think this is an incredible lever for reinventing what's public through these boards. But I do think a lot of them, at their worst, are just caretakers and don't truly understand it. And in some sense, that can be okay at the accounting level and the legal level. But I do think you need 1 to 2 people on every board, preferably the board chair, who truly gets what an amazing school is and can coach that CEO. And I would agree with you that we're a little underdeveloped in the sector in producing those kind of top quartile board members.
Nina, is this on the Alliance's agenda, the charter school board issue?
Well, it is, but in an indirect way.
Okay.
So our work is primarily policy, federal policy, state policy, and to the extent there are levers that can and should be pulled to create or encourage the creation of high-quality boards at the state level, we're happy to consider them. But it is at the heart of the quality of the school. And I would also say, I mean, the private school space to me, it's similar, right? The types of people you want on charter school board are going to be similar to ones who are on private school boards. And there is a whole body of information that groups like the National Association of Independent Schools have created that we can and should be leveraging. And I don't know how much discussion there is with groups like that to do that. Albeit the boards of these private schools are comprised of people who are sending their kids to the private schools. So it's a tad different, but in terms of expertise and what they do on a day-to-day basis, I think we should be trying to learn from them.
Yeah, please check out the Wall Street Journal piece on your table, because in our Bluebird of Happiness mode, Bruno and Brandon and I wrote that not only are charters reinventing local control in American public education, but they're also, at least in the good cases, attracting to their boards the very kinds of people that the reformers of 1900 hoped would end up on local school boards. Sort of civic-minded community leaders who care about kids. Rather than, aspiring legislators and people with grudges. So it doesn't always work that way, especially in the one-off charter schools that, got 300 kids and one principal, and those needs an awful lot of backup from a board of 6 people that may not have all of the relevant expertises. But still, I think there's some real potential here, and I think everybody in this room who is not on a board of a charter school, in addition to being a philanthropist with a charter school, should get on at least one board and contribute what you know and what you're able to do. One more question, and then we will move onward. Yes?
Thanks so much. My name is Carrie Irvin, and in a moment of wonderful synergy, I actually raised my hand before the last 5 minutes. I run an organization called Charter Board Partners, and we are focused on the quality and effectiveness of charter school and CMO boards. And I actually raised my hand to follow up on Molly's question to ask for this panel's help. We're already getting lots of help from Checker in your book and in the article about how we as a sector can answer this criticism that independent governance is less democratic, when I actually think it's a lot more democratic. So Neerav, you've already answered that, as has Nina. I'd love to hear from Kevin, but I'll add another layer to the question, which I think another reason that boards in this sector that we need to really be focusing on how important boards are in leadership is around the issue of diversity, that boards are a way to really get at this issue of we are doing reform to communities instead of with communities, and boards actually put people who live in and work in and who send their kids to charter schools in not just advisory or figurehead capacities, but actually decision-making and leadership capacities. So Kevin, particularly from the CEO perspective, and Neerav, if you want to chime back in on the issue of diversity, I'd love to hear a little bit more about how we as a sector can be answering the question of why independent governance, even though it's non-elected, is actually a more democratic and a way to introduce more authentic community engagement into the leadership of ed reform.
That was partly statement and partly question, but do you have a comment, Kevin?
Sure, happy. Agree. I think it's a critical piece of it. I would say on the sort of curve of the groups that we work with, the first couple years for an entrepreneur, getting the founding board is important. But I would say it's not in the top 3 things that ensure success or not success. I think it becomes much more important when you're sort of trying to go from 2 or 3 to bigger and beyond, and then when you are really institution building. And I think we're working pretty hard with all of our portfolio members on how to try to think about building their board as an institution that reflects the communities that they serve.
Good. Thank you very much. Thank you for good questions. Pick up your clickers again, please. We're going to close with some looking ahead questions and ask you to participate in them. Get up your technology again, please, Anthony. And you already know the technique here. First question, what do you predict will most characterize the charter school movement over the next 25 years? You're going to have to pick one again. Growth will continue gradually, but cannot keep up with demand. The challenges of facilities will curb growth. Long-term results, presumably good ones, will give charters more credibility to scale faster. Political battles are going to get worse and deter growth. By sharing what works and partnering with all schools, political battles will diminish. So you might call that the Pollyanna answer. Sufficient talent to do all this will be hard to attract. And finally, big CMOs will begin looking and acting more like districts. Make a prediction. You can only pick one, even if you suspect that more than one of these might happen. Going. Tabulation. Okay. The largest number of you think the political battles will increase and slow growth. The tied for second place, growth will continue but not keep up with demand. And long-term results, good ones, I trust, will give charters more credibility to scale faster. And in fourth place, but still with a lot of votes, the big CMOs are going to begin looking and acting more like districts. Interesting. No comments other than here's the next question. This is a should question, similar to one I asked Kevin. How much to invest in the infrastructure of authorizing and advocacy and policy and talent and so forth versus investing in actual schools? Option A, infrastructure needs more attention than it's getting. Option B, more butts in seats is what we need to focus on. And option C, we're doing it about right today. Going. Well, infrastructure needs more attention. There's no question which one of these wins. So I hope you put your money where your mouth is. Thank you very much. Got another question. Should we focus on a handful of cities that are charter friendly and high need? Or should we strive to get a charter toehold in as many places as possible? This does not give you as many nuanced options as Neerav gave you. You're going to have to pick between beef up the sector in places that need it and are receptive to it, or spread charters as widely as possible, or national funders should focus on places and local funders should put down their buckets where they are. Pick one. The latter. National funders should do what they've been doing, which is concentrate, and local funders should do what they can in the places where they are investing. And finally, I think this is the last one. What should be done to minimize the impact of those who, in this phrase, dim the charter light? A question I asked Nina. Greedy EMOs, flawed virtual schools, and other enemies from within. A, it's a problem for states and authorizers, not for funders. B, funders need to take this seriously and invest in policies and advocates that are working to reduce it. And C, there will always be bad apples, so focus on growing more good apples. Pick one. Tabulation, whoa. More good apples in mild first place, and take it seriously and invest in ways of reducing it in a high second place. And basically nobody is saying, well, one or two of you are saying, this is not a problem for funders. Let the states and the authorizers worry about it themselves. Thank you very much for the participatory part of this. Anthony reminds you, as does the screen, that they want the clickers back. They're expensive and they don't have any more of them. So leave them at the door on your way out or on your table. And with that, join me in thanking a terrific panel and a great audience.